The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 12th chapter. Glory to you, Lord. Jesus said, I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it is completed. Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided. 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. They will be divided. Father against son, and son against father. Mother against daughter, and daughter against mother. Mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. He also said to the crowd, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you immediately say, it is going to rain, and so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say, there will be scorching heat, and it happens. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? The Gospel of the Lord. So rising healthcare costs have been a really important big issue for almost everybody and every organization. And the church is no exception to that. So in the ELCA, we have an organization called Portico, which administers all the health benefits and the retirement benefits for pastors and for other church leaders. And as you might expect, like a lot of other health plan administrators, they've been spending a lot of time over the last few years trying to figure out how to encourage us to live healthier lives so that we both can serve better and also cost them less money in the plan. So every year, they ask us to take a thing called the Health Risk Assessment. It's a survey that Mayo Clinic puts together, and they ask us all kinds of information about the results of our last physical, to our diet and exercise routines, and things like our sleep patterns and stress levels. And it's all confidential, but if you do this, they put $150 immediately into your flexible spending account for healthcare, and they let you earn $350 more, so I always take it every year without failing. First year, though, that I did it, as we're going through this survey, they asked me about my level of stress. They asked all of us about our level of stress. And they give you a scale from 1 to 10, and they said, 1 is low, 10 is high, what's your level of stress? So I thought about that for a little bit, and I was not sure how to answer that question because they didn't give us any metrics or any examples about high stress, low stress, stuff like that. So I thought about my life, and I thought about the things that stressed me and the things that stressed other people around me. And I thought, well, I don't think that I'm terribly more stressed or less stressed than the people that I'm regularly around. So I figure I'm pretty average. So between 1 and 10, I scored myself 5 because I figured that's average. I'm kind of in the middle. And for the next year, every time that I went onto my personal Portico page, I was greeted with apocalyptic sayings like, your stress level is too high! You have to do something about your stress! I was directed to all manner of websites that would counsel me on how to reduce my stress, and little vignettes popped up of people who had written things about how they had successfully conquered stress in their lives and how their lives were so much better now. For a whole year this went on, and honestly, it was stressing me out. So I figured out how to manage stress in my life.
Score yourself a 1 next year.
The next year, I scored myself 2. And after that, I started to get all these things about how well I was doing managing stress, and complimenting me for my stress management techniques and how great it was and all that kind of stuff. And that was how I learned to manage stress. But it got me to thinking about stress. And the thing that really bugged me about that question was that the question asked me what was the level of stress in my life. It did not ask me how I managed my stress, whether I was managing my stress, or whether my stress management techniques were actually healthy or not. It also made me realize that if Jesus were to take the Portico stress question on the health risk assessment test, he would be in a lot of trouble. Because if I got apocalyptic warnings because I said 5 on a scale of 1 to 10, Imagine what Jesus would score if he said what he says in today's gospel reading, "I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it's completed." They would just go absolutely nuts with that kind of an answer. Clearly, Jesus knows that he is under a lot of stress, and he doesn't sound happy about it. Yet at the same time, he's not looking to get out of that stress, at least not until he's accomplished his mission. Somehow, for Jesus, there was something that was worthwhile and important about accepting stress, even a high level of stress, at least for a little while. And in a world in which we are so often told that stress, any stress, is like a horrible disease that you should absolutely try to avoid at all costs, that's your central mission. Jesus here says somehow or other stress, at least in this instance, is important for him to accept and live with for a little while. Because at least in this instance, Jesus' willingness to accept even a high level of stress means that he notices that people are having problems. He opens his eyes, he sees that people are in need, he understands that folks are in trouble in ways that they cannot get themselves out of. And he notices. And sometimes a good way to deal with stress and just have no stress in your life is to close your eyes and to close your news feeds and to pretend you don't see and stop looking. There's a great meme that goes around on Facebook and several places that says something like, my desire to remain well-informed is at odds with my desire to remain sane. Because sometimes the way to avoid stress is simply to pretend you don't see and to stop looking around. But here, at least in this case, Jesus is willing to accept the stress because the stress comes with the fact that you notice. And even more than that, Jesus not only notices, but he's stressed because he cares. He actually cares that people have these problems, and he's not willing to just walk away, because the other way to deal with stress is to go, yeah, I see those problems, but I don't care. I'll just walk away from it. And Jesus won't do that. And sometimes caring carries with it a certain level of stress. That's just the way it goes. And Jesus here is saying God cares, he cares, he even cares about the fact that even the good news he brings is going to divide people up. There's all this stuff about, you think that I've come to bring peace on the earth, and Jesus does want peace, but in the process of bringing the good news and bringing God's love and God's hope to the world, it's going to divide people up, even within their own household. And Jesus knows that, and he cares about it. And that's the kind of stuff that can produce stress. And even more than that, Jesus is willing to accept the stress because he's willing to endure even personal sacrifice and suffering in order to do something about the problems that people face. The Greek word that is translated stress in today's gospel reading is actually a word that usually means to be physically held down or pressed upon. So it's used again in Luke's gospel, where it's describing what the soldiers are doing to Jesus as they beat him up and mock him. They physically hold him down, press him down. And it's a reminder that stress here is not simply something you have in your mind or in your gut, but is an actual thing that happens to you when you interpose yourself to prevent somebody else from suffering. Jesus is willing to accept the stress, at least now, until his mission is accomplished, because he's going to actually do something about the problems that people face. So my conclusion is that Portico is wrong, and Jesus is right. Which is actually a pretty easy thing to come up with. But stress is not necessarily a bad thing to be avoided, because sometimes it's a sign that you're following Jesus because you notice and you care and you're willing to act in order to bring about God's love in the world. Yet at the same time, stress really does need to be managed, and it needs to be dealt with in healthy ways. And while Jesus does not explicitly address stress management in this passage, I think that this passage can help us in dealing with stress in our own lives, because it points out that Jesus notices us and even notices our stress. This is the only place in all four Gospels that Jesus actually says that he's stressed. Every place else, I mean, usually we read about Jesus and we see that, Jesus does all these things. He helps people, he cares for people, all that kind of stuff. But here Jesus actually says that he's stressed. And in doing so, he makes it clear that he understands and identifies with us, even with the things that we least like to deal with, like stress. And sometimes part of stress management is just understanding that you are not alone. And it would be easy for us to kind of say, well, yeah, God notices some of the big picture things about how we're dealing with things in our world, but when I'm sitting alone and I'm thinking about all the stuff that's bothering me, that presses me down, that hurts me, that kind of stress, God notices that too. God's with me in that moment. God understands that. Sometimes the first part of dealing with that stress is noticing that God is with me in that place as well. And more than that, when Jesus cares, when Jesus' stress is partly because God cares, and we know that God cares about the whole world, one of the things that stresses me out, and maybe stresses you out too, is that I see all the stuff that's going on in the world, and sometimes just in my local community, and I go, man, if I could just generate more caring for that because I'm exhausted, but I really should care more. And I really should get angry and upset about some of this stuff. And sometimes I start to think that problems are going to be solved by the amount of righteous indignation that I or a group of us can generate about a problem. One of the things that Jesus wants to show us is that somehow God's love, God's care, really does in the end win out over all of the evil, all of the stress, all the horrible things that are going on in the world. It doesn't depend on us being able to generate enough righteous indignation to fix those problems. And sometimes managing the stress, when we look around and we care and we know we should care about these things, and we do, sometimes managing that stress is simply realizing that sometimes, like so many of the 12-step groups say, you've got to let go and let God. And know that in the end, it's God's love and it's God's care that are going to make the most difference. And for us too, even though we are also called to be people who reach out, help, and actually do something about the problems that we see in the lives of our local communities and in the world around us, it's important to realize that Jesus actually endured the stress. We always sit there and say, a lot of times we go, this stress is going to kill me. Well, the stress actually did kill Jesus. Jesus was willing to endure the stress until it killed him. But he accomplished his mission, and he rose again. And finally, in the end, the stress that killed Jesus was the stress that hung on the cross, and that actually saved the world. That actually saves us. And the action that's going to save us and the whole world is the action God has already taken. And then finally, in the end, whatever needs to change and happen in the world to finally fix it depends upon God and not upon us. And sometimes remembering that simple point is a way to have strength and to deal with stress and to keep on going. There is an old saying that probably most of you have heard, don't let stress kill you, let the church help. So often it does. But really, let Jesus help. Jesus helps us by showing us that stress is not some horrible disease that we need to avoid at all costs, but sometimes is the necessary result of noticing and caring and serving others. And in enduring stress himself, Jesus shows us that we're not alone, that he understands and identifies with us and with the stresses of life that we face. Jesus promises us that the stress of evil and hardship in our lives finally will not be able to overcome the power of God's love and God's care. And most of all, Jesus calls us to remember that we aren't called to carry or solve the stress and weight of the entire world, because in Jesus, God has already done that.